Welcome to Blur, where stories come alive through sound. Chapter 12. The Film of Her Life. July 1960 to January 1961. Gable said about me, "When she's there, she's there. She's there to work. I now live in my work, and in a few relationships with the few people I can really count on." The Misfits was originally scheduled for shooting in the fall of 1959, but Monroe's agreement with Fox to do Let's Make Love and Clark Gable's work in it happened in Naples put off filming of The Misfits until the spring of 1960. Then the actors' strike during the filming of Let's Make Love and other production delays meant that Monroe would not be available for another role until the middle of July. As a result, there was hardly a break between the two films, with just a few hectic days in New York spent on costume fittings and test photography for The Misfits. She rushed to Reno, Nevada, where a cast and crew of over 200 awaited her appearance on the set of what had been intended as the masterwork of her career and the fulfillment of her life. Unfortunately, she and Miller had waited too long to consummate their joint vision. Their marriage was dying, and they were forced to engage in a furious struggle against each other to maintain their integrity as persons and professionals, an integrity that once seemed as indivisible as the marriage itself. All elements of the production, the original screenplay by a major American writer, the best director for it, John Huston, and the perfect casting, inspired Frank Taylor, the film's producer, to call The Misfits the ultimate motion picture. Each of them, Marilyn, Clark, Monty Clift, Illy Wallach, Thelma Ritter, is the person they play. The line between art and life was perilously thin. Everything about this independent, austere the film of her Liff E200 movie, characters, locations, stunts, and story, had to be as authentic as possible, deliberately antithetical to machine-made, studio-faked extravagances like Let's Make Love. On The Misfits, there would be no closed set, as there had been on The Prince and the Showgirl. James Good was permitted to write a diary-like version of the filming. Mag Num received permission to field a group of photographers on the set. Numerous friends and acquaintances of the cast and crew visited, as did other celebrities and the press. It was as if the makers of The Misfits wanted intimate contact, not only with the Western environment they were depicting, but also with the larger world outside the movie set. The Misfits, 1960, the film of her Liff E201 Wallach, Ritter, and Clift, described the normal difficulties of film making they were trying to overcome. No rehearsal before the first day's shooting. Lack of ensemble playing between actors who do not know each other's work habits. The distractions of the lights and the crew requiring a concentration more intense than that used in preparing plays. And the minute adjustments the actor must effect to portray the essence of a character. This instant commentary on movie-making, while they were making the movie, represented a virtual catalog of the disruptions and disarrangements of Monroe's replicated life. Montgomery Clift, in particular, felt the self-reflexive quality that informed his own as well as Monroe's role. In a naked admission of the life-like nature of film, which sometimes attaches itself to the actor's vulnerable person in a way he cannot shake off, Clift commented, "Someone said, 'My God, it's exactly like you. Now it's just a question of can I do it? It is a wonderful part, and if I don't do it justice, I'll shoot myself.'" Miller denied having written the character specifically for Clift, but like Gable and Monroe, Clift would inhabit his role, making it look like a fusion of art and life. Huston abetted the actors in achieving an organic bond between themselves and their characters by shooting The Misfits in chronological sequence, an unusual and expensive way of filming that furthered the natural evolution of their characters. Monroe had never had the opportunity to develop a role in continuity, except in Don't Bother to Knock, in which the director, Roy Baker, followed a rehearsal format resembling that used for a stage play. Huston was well known for his subtle, unobtrusive handling of actors, and ever grateful for his faith in her performance in The Asphalt Jungle. Monroe could be hopeful their collaboration would reveal new dimensions of her talent, as it had 10 years earlier. At the same time, Monroe had grave doubts about the script, and was angry about Rosalind's wishy-washy character, which Miller still had not strengthened after years of work on the script. In desperation, Monroe put in a call to Norman Roston, as he recalls in his memoir, Marilyn, an untold story demanding that Roston tell Miller, who she put on the phone, That one of Roslin's speeches needed a complete rewrite. The uncomfortable Roslin said he would give his opinion if Miller asked for it. Miller made no request, but an irate Monroe continued to berate her husband about his awful writing. Monroe was not alone in rejecting Miller's defective script. As Donald Spoto reports, John Huston had similar doubts. Although he expressed the film of her life E200 to them deferentially, and in the disguise of Hollywood hyperbole about what a magnificent job Miller had done. Even more telling, Elia Kazan wrote to Miller, full of Huston-like compliments, then delivering the bad news about thematic finger-pointing and the film's unresolved ending, which did not work because of the girl, a little too, well, too a lot of things, too right, too often too pure, too aware. In Time Bends, Miller virtually concedes that Kazan and Monroe were right, but he confesses that he could not change his approach to Roslin because his vision of her emanated from his futile effort to save his marriage. In other words, to expose Roslin's shortcomings would mean the end of his effort to repair his rapport with Monroe. Only after Monroe's death, with the production of Miller's play, After the Fall, could he reveal the dark side of the Marilyn myth that had enveloped him. Just as Ted Hughes dared not probe the overpowering mythology of Sylvia Plath's life and death till the posthumous publication of Birthday Letters. In both cases, these writer-husbands present themselves as in the grip of a self-destructive dynamic beyond their resources to remedy. Like the nameless woman in Miller's short story, Please Don't Kill Anything, and like the Marilyn Monroe of his life tribute, Roslyn Tabor declares her reverence for the permanence of things. I can't stand to kill anything. Roslyn claps her hands to her ears in surprise and profound dismay over the impending capture of the Mustangs, just as the woman in Please Don't Kill Anything put her hands to her cheeks in shock over the sudden capture of the fish that are gathered in the fisherman's net. In The Misfits, we see the world as a woman sees it, but in this case Roslyn's modes of perception, and what they stand for metaphorical lie, are explored and to some extent modified by a complex drama of who-man relationships only hinted at in the life tribute and briefly sketched in the short story. In one sense, Roslyn's all-encompassing vision turns her into a vibrant nature symbol, and even into a tender metaphor for life itself. She moves in sensitive solidarity with plants, animals, and people. She offers herself as an exuberant and generous unifying principle of the kind Miller lightly touches on in life, when he praises the manifestations of Monroe's beauty and spirit in what might be called her natural, everyday self, playing with the dog, redoing the cleaning woman's hair, emerging from the ocean after a swim, or bursting into the house full of news. Roslyn is a golden girl who comes busting out of the closet. Gay tells her, "You just shine in my eyes." Guido remarks on how she lights up his house and how she the film of her life E203 has the gift of life. As her cowboy companions get to know her, she virtually becomes their source of light, their point of reference, as when Gay tells her, "Honey, when you smile it's like the sun comin' up." The metaphors arising out of seemingly casual speech are meant to render the men's growing sense of discovery that Roslyn has, in Guido's words, the big connection. You're really hooked in. Whatever happens to anybody, it happens to you. Most of these metaphors shift from the concrete impression the males have of her person to rather abstract, even mystical, yearnings. By achieving oneness with her, each would fill the emptiness he feels in his lack of relation to family, to society, to the world at large, where he is regarded as a misfit. Roslyn's gift is to minister to each man equally, even if the help she offers is simply a heartfelt hello to Guido at a time when he feels most alienated from himself and others, to Perse a gentle mothering that allows him to probe his disaffections, and to Gay a resolute but pliable sense of her own femininity that persuades him to accept, in a manner similar to Sam's in Please Don't Kill Anything, the other half of the world, the female side he has always dismissed from his world of permanence and self-sufficiency. These men ignore, and sometimes even fight against Roslyn's adamant defense of life's sacredness. Their contrary urge is to make life a test, as in Perse's rodeo riding and the roping of the Mustangs. But Roslyn N. forces her will to free the captured misfit Mustangs, a family, a stallion, 4 mares, and a colt, not unlike the misfit family of 3 men and 1 woman she joins together. She does so not by arguing beliefs, but by fully responding to life in a manner that justifies the metaphors the men used to describe her. For example, when Perce rides his bull, Rosalind does not hear the crowd roaring, and she is only partly involved in observing him hang on for his prize, for his life really. Her sense of the scene is more organic. She feels the ground shake as the bull pounds out across the arena. She feels the thunder of its weight and the resounding answers from deep below the ground. She nearly goes blind as her world shakes and seems to fall pieces. If Rosalind's eyes can seem larger than life in the breadth of their Roman 6 Sion, and if she seems capable of joining the sun and earth in staring at Gay, there is a sense in which she exists not before but after the fall. In her own way, she is just as solitary as the other characters, and her organic grasp of life has not been allowed to develop. She tells Gay, who gardens for her in an Eden of their own making, "I never really saw anything grow before." She has never had possession of herself until, for the F-ilm of her Lif E204 moment, she feels his love and is no longer afraid. "It was like my life flew into my body." For the first time, Rosalind searches for the meaning of life, which often eludes her. Many of her statements are questions and tentative probings of relationships. She has failed at marriage once, and she seems caught in some indeterminate, mystifying stage between childhood and adulthood. Miller suggests something like this about Monroe and life that provokes Guido to comment. "One minute she looks dumb and brand new, like a kid, but maybe her first husband caught her knockin' around, huh?" The Finn ESD expression of Rosalind's quest for wholeness occurs when she flies into a warm, longing solo dance among the weeds, and coming to a great tree she halts and then embraces it, pressing her face against its trunk. As Monroe had hugged a tree in Sam Shaw's photograph of her in Connecticut in 1956, Rosalind seeks to steady herself in the grip of nature and in the presence of its creatures. For she also presses her face against the dog who quivers during the Mustang hunt, just as she quivers when she first realizes that the horses will not only be captured, but killed and used for dog food. The dog and the tree save her from solitary suffering. So does the dance toward the tree, her metaphor for life's permanence, as Miller himself had once been for Monroe, when she said meeting him was like running into a tree. Rosalind's moment of self-fulfillment, her embrace of the tree, is reminiscent of one of Monroe's own lyric fragments. To the weeping willow, "I stood beneath your limbs and you flowered and finally clung to me, and when the wind struck with earth and sand, you clung to me." The tree in Monroe's poem is both symbol and fact, her friend Norman Roston pointed out, for it had been planted under her watchful eye at her country place. Like Monroe's unfinished poem, The Misfits takes its tone from the fruition of human and natural relationships, with the female character acting as the erotic magnet drawing the world together. There are Edenic moments in The Misfits when the characters try to make the desert bloom, when Rosalind goes all out and seems equal to enjoying life in its fullness, when Gay blesses her for making him feel as if he has touched the whole world. But those innocent, metaphoric the F-ilm of her Lif E205 prehensions of existence are tempered by Rosalind's worries, by her sense of being lost, and by her need for help, because she does not know where she belongs. She seeks guidance from Gay, but cannot reconcile herself to his gentle, paradoxical insistence. So like Sam's in "Please Don't Kill Anything," and probably like Miller's as well, that "Honey, a kind man can kill." The filming of Rosalind's unreconciled state was Monroe's most arduous assignment. On July 21, during the shooting of her character's first appearance, the temperature in the bedroom setting reached 100 degrees, with Huston, his crew, and their equipment crowded in together with the actress. After Isabel, Thelma Ritter, is seen calling Rosalind to hurry up. The camera concentrates on a mirror Rosalind uses both to make herself up and to memorize the lines she will deliver in applying for a divorce. Isabel is rather like the strong-minded but sensitive female coaches and confidantes Monroe relied on. Like Natasha Lydes, Paula Strasberg, and Hedda Roston, she is a woman from an ear-liar generation, helping her young charge compose herself. Even this early in shooting The Misfits, Monroe had to have been acutely conscious that this film was living her life in a new dimension. Not simply by making her character late and by giving her trouble with lines, but by revealing the struggle of going through a rehearsal and replication of self. Rosalind, like Marilyn, wants to articulate herself authentically, I can't remember this. It's not the way it was, she says. She resists putting on a face and a dialogue in what might be called this behind-the-scenes scene, which in Huston's capable direction gives the lie to earlier backstage and powder room scenes in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, and How to Marry a Millionaire where Lorelai and Pola are happily content with putting on the roles they play. Instead, Rosalind resents her scripted self and is shown to be on the verge of a hysteria and exhaustion akin to Cherie's frail fretfulness in Bus Stop. But Rosalind seems much older and more mature than Cherie and more disillusioned. For once, there is less of a gap in age and temperament between Monroe and the character she plays. How much Monroe's own physical fatigue contributed to this scene is hard to gauge. When James Good asked her whether she would discuss how much energy her acting took, she replied, "No, because I didn't start with any." As with Cherie, Elsie, and Sugar, experience has taken its toll on Rosalind, and she is wary. But Rosalind is alone in expressing her worry over the ambiguity of human relationships, and her doubt that any genuine communication is possible. She knows she is a misfit, and she reacts som the F-ilm of her Lif E206 Burley to the atmosphere of Reno, the divorce capital, heavy with failure. In part, Rosalind's languid demeanor at the beginning of the film may be an indication of how the divorce has numbed her and made her temporar wily incapable of the outgoing emotions and gestures usually associated with Monroe's screen personas. This languorousness perhaps explains why some critics find Rosalind rather remote and amorphous. Only in the course of her awakening is she able to pin down the troubling issues that have made her back away from full involvement with others and from understanding of herself. Somehow Rosalind has escaped most of Gable 1960, the F-ilm of her Lif E207, the cynicism and self-pity Guido harbors in himself. And the mirror shot in Monroe's first scene reflects a rudimentary purity, complicated by disappointment, but expressive nevertheless of an innocence highlighted for the first time when she sees Gay's dog, Tom Dooley. Her affection for animals animates her. Her eyes appear completely open for what seems like the first time during this transitional scene, taking her from her divorce to her new life with Guido, Gay, and eventually Perce. When Gay tells Rosalind she shines in his eyes, he is, to be sure, complimenting her, but he is also commenting, however inadvertently, on her reflective capacity and on his power to measure it. A power the film points up by isolating the glint in his eye. In the film of the Misfits, it is obvious that Gable is courting Monroe, and his compliment, not Gay's, confers upon Monroe the status of a cynosure of the screen. In the cinema novel that Miller wrote based on the movie script, Rosalind's consciousness controls such scenes as the one at the rodeo, where the very ground shakes in accord with her trembling concern for Perce. In their first big close-up, when Gable leans over to kiss Monroe, and she responds by confessing she does not feel that way about him. Gable's easy assurance that in time she just might is tied to his movie persona as the King of Hollywood, who for so many years carried his roles with a bluff, hearty confidence. The aplomb with which he receives Monroe's mild rebuff seems tinged with sly humor over her demurrer before the most romantic, masculine figure the movies have produced, the father idol of his co-star. Although Gable and Monroe look to performances in The Misfits to prove their prowess as actors, not just personalities, and although neither of them does anything to disturb the consistency of their characters, Gay and Rosalind, the sensation of actors moving in tandem with their screen personalities is undeniable. It had been Monroe's lifelong dream to play opposite Gable in the movies, but the prospect of performing with him also put pressure on her to be perfect. A pressure he unfailingly and gallantly tried to relieve by taking every opportunity to encourage her, in one instance kissing her after an especially well-done scene. John Huston said that in private Gable was nonplussed by Monroe's unprofessional behavior, but in public he remained deferential to her and protective, as if he was willing to impersonate the father-lover she saw in him for the sake of her emotional health and of the tender scenes in The Misfits, which reflected her desire to be his consort. Thelma Ritter observed, His picture is a little unlike any I've done before, because it depends on the personalities and the F-ilm of her Lif E208 relationship of the actors. We stage actors don't get this kind of jazz. They'd say, what's she playing? There's more emphasis on the stage on roles, not personality. Actors in The Misfits could not simply escape into their roles and become their characters. In fact, the film depended on the clash and coordination of personalities, not just on playing, as stage AC tours would have it. From the middle of July to nearly the end of August, Monroe and her 3 male leads struggled with the cumbersome first half of the script, which required Gable, Wallach, and Clift to vie for the honor of charming her. Each man has to have his turn to dance with her, to woo her, and she has to receive all of them openly without encouraging their advances. She gently probes the reasons for their lovelessness and nurses their sensitivities. At the same time, she is in their care, as they show her how they live in accord with the West's freedom, its frontier mentality. Although the careful approach to personalities provided fine shadings of character, to Monroe the Misfits seemed irresolute and Rosalind too elastic, given the enormous demands upon her compassion and her loyalty to each man. Huston and Miller constantly conferred on changes in the script, sometimes debating wording and camera work. In spite of all the planning, the shooting and continuity, the fine cast and crew, the picture lost coherence, and each day was devoted to tinkering with the disordered pieces. As Monroe reached the center of the film, where Rosalind, Guido, and Gay accompany Perse to the rodeo in exchange for his agreement to join them in the Mustang hunt, Monroe had to play Rosalind's hysterical fears for Perse's life, followed by a demanding 5-minute scene, the longest take Huston had ever filmed, with Clift just after he is injured at the rodeo. It was necessary to summon all aspects of Rosalind's to soothe Perse's wounded body and spirit. Increasing her intake of Nembutals in the evening, Monroe relied ever more heavily on Ralph Roberts's morning massages and on the ministrations of others who tried to walk her into wakefulness and prop her up with coffee. At night, in Miller's presence, she would sometimes get hysterical, and he would try to calm her with innocuous conversation. But in the middle of the night, she would lose control and rage at him. He was close to a breakdown himself, and Nan Taylor, the producer's wife, persuaded Miller to take a separate room. A prolonged fit of anxiety kept Monroe away from the set on August 27 and led to her breakdown, officially announced on August 29, when the F-ilm of her LIF E-209 was flown for medical care to Los Angeles. The whole production shut down, and shooting did not resume until her reappearance on the set on September 6. At Westside Hospital in Los Angeles, Monroe was gradually weaned off of Nembutal and put in a milder medication. She received visits from Miller, Huston, the Strasbergs, and other friends, including Joe DiMaggio, who began to emerge as one of her dearest supporters. In truth, he had never given up the possibility of remarrying Monroe, and in notes to himself in the April 4, 1955 issue of Sports Illustrated, he emphasized, "Forget ego and pride. Be warm, affectionate, and love. Be patient no matter what." He cautioned himself not to be jealous. "Remember, this is not your wife. She is a fine girl, and remember how unhappy you made her. Happiness is what you strive for her. Don't talk about her business or her friends. Be friendly toward her friends. Don't forget how lonesome and unhappy you are, especially without her." 10 days after her collapse, she visited him briefly before returning to Reno to finish The Misfits. To Huston, in the hospital, she seemed to have made great progress, appearing bright and alert. He could see that she was aware that the drugs were destroying her, and she asked his forgiveness. He remembered reassuring her. In spite of some setbacks, upon her return her acting was stronger, and she had more control over herself. Just before her breakdown, she had to do retakes of the rodeo scenes, since her reactions to Perse's dangerous stunts were exaggerated, perhaps a sign of her impending neurasthenic collapse. Now she evinced a new calm in her treatment of Miller. On one occasion, they even went on a walk together, and on another Miller danced with her to demonstrate the kind of action he had in mind for one scene. They were not intimate, not even for the sake of public appearances, but the contest between them abated and would not revive until the final tense days of filming. Monroe resumed work on the 5-minute scene with Clift. In speaking to Clift as Perse, she was perfectly in tune with herself as Rosalind. Like Rosalind, who complains that her husband was not there, Perse regrets that his mother, after her remarriage, could not hear him. He puts his head in Rosalind's lap to ease the aches of mind and body. She responds to his garrulity, prompted by his drinking and dancing, by trying to quiet him and to smooth over the rough edges he has acquired in proving himself. Just as Gay acts as her father lover, So Monroe as Rosalind, the film of her life E210, acts as mother-lover to Clift as Perse. As W. J. Weatherby sensed when he noticed Monroe behaving like a concerned mother hen, while the reporter spoke with Clift. Frank Taylor called Monroe and Clift psychic twins, and Weatherby observed that Clift was sensitive to any vibes from or around Monroe. The actors shared their insecurities, their drinking and drug problems, and treated each other affectionately from their first shy meeting sometime after the completion of Bus Stop. As Robert LaGuardia, one of Clift's biographers, puts it, Marilyn could bitch and laugh and feel as uninhibited as she wanted around him. Clift responded in kind, first as himself, then as Perse, revealing to Rosalind fundamental misgivings about himself. I don't understand how you're supposed to do. On the set of The Misfits, Clift spoke to James Good of the actor's need to lose himself. The long scene with Monroe accomplishes just that, for it portrays an exquisite exfoliation of Perse's hardened self, the one who does not mind the rousing rodeo stunts and who accepts the hard world of male rivalries. This supreme blending of the actor with his art is what Monroe was always seeking, and what she and Clift managed between them in a setting suggestive of their characters' fragmentary careers. Tea hay emerged behind the saloon. Trash, a mound of empty liquor-bought tealess and beer cans, broken cartons, are littered about. In the moonlight, cameraman Russell Maddie was actually shooting day for night. Rosalind and Perse articulate the miscellaneousness of their betrayed lives. Maybe all there really is what happens next. Just the next thing, and you're not supposed to remember anybody's promises. Rosalind speculates. It is impossible to say how many times Monroe and Clift obliterated the thin margins between their on- and off-screen selves while working on their 5-minute scene. That more than usual was at stake was clear from the closed set. From Gable's keen interest in being present, he was not even on call to act that day, and from the rehearsal time used before filming. At first, both Clift and Monroe had trouble with their dialogue. Then, after several takes, they finished the scene without missing any lines. Monroe complimented Clift on his performance, was herself reassured by Miller, and checked with Paula Strasberg just as Huston Decide the scene should be repeated. 2 more takes were spoiled, one by Monroe, who thought she had shifted Clift's bandage out of place, and one by Clift, who had trouble with a line. Good reports that Monroe clutched him to her in compassion for his mistake. In the next take, she the film of her life E211 missed a word. Near the end of the day, tension mounted, as 2 more takes were ruined before the final perfect scene was shot. Compared to the multiple takes of much shorter scenes, this long, beautifully modulated exchange between Clift and Monroe was performed with economy and grace. Clift might have been thinking of this outstanding scene when he commented after Monroe's death that working with her was fantastic. Like an escalator, you would meet her on one level, and then she would rise higher, and you would rise to that point, and then you both would go higher. She evidently responded to Clift's sincerity as an actor with an ingenuousness of her own, rarely apparent to other actors, even Jack Lemmon, who admired her, but who noted her tendency to act ad instead of with you. Clift would not have concurred with Lemmon's conclusion, why you just got so far with her, and then you could feel a curtain drop, and you didn't go beyond that. I suspect nobody in the world really understood Marilyn. The second half of The Misfits profited immensely from Monroe's recovery and resilience. Both the shooting of the film and the pacing of its scenes quickened from the moment Rosalind feels the dog shivering and begins to inquire into the purpose of the Mustang hunt. Like Monroe herself, who at this time became, in Giles's words, alive to her surroundings, Rosalind explores her environment with renewed intensity. As her questions become more pointed, the cowboys must confront their own complicity in decimating their dreams of a frontier past, in which Mustangs were used to settle a wild country and not to feed dogs, the tamed animals of modern consumer culture. Rosalind appears helpless not only to stop the hunt, but also to mount an effective objection to it, since, as Gay reminds her, she eats steaks and gives Tom Dooley dog food made of Mustang meat. She appears naive, and lacking the courage to accept her own compromises with killing. The momentum of the film is against her, for the men are taking all the risks. Beside them, she seems merely hysterical and belittled by the vast western landscape. Conceding Gay's victory over the Mustangs, "You won," she tells him, She tries to restrain him, but he sweeps her to the ground with his arm. Finally, she breaks out of the frame that Gay, Guido, and Perse have established in the chase sequence by recentering herself at a considerable distance from them. As Nick Barbero observes, Essie is at a totally different depth from the men in the foreground on either side. The film of her Liff E212, they see Rosalind walking. She is heading across the open lake bed. Rosalind, Gay takes a step and halts himself. She has swerved about. Her shadow sketches toward them. 40 yards away, she screams, her body writhing, bending over as though to catapult her hatred. "You liars, all of you!" Clenching her fists, she screams toward their faces. "Liars!" Unnerved, Gay flinches. "Man, big man, you're only living when you can watch something die. Kill everything, that's all you want. Why don't you just kill yourself and be happy?" She runs toward them, but stops as though afraid and says directly toward Gay, "You, with your God's country, freedom," she screams into his face. "I hate you." Unable to bear it, Gay utters, "We've had it now, Rosalind. You sure did, more than you'll ever know, but you didn't want it. Nobody does. I pity you all." Looking from one to another, and beyond them to imagined others. "You know everything, except what it feels like to be alive. You're 3 dear, sweet dead men." Rosalind is almost out of control, voicing her bitterest feelings and severing her connection with the cowboys even as her shadow, their conscience, approaches them. In the space she has created, she performs what almost amounts to an exorcism, an exhaustion of her hostility. At the same time, she is attacking man, as well as these men who serve a rapacious society. The urge to destroy, she implies, is ultimately suicidal. She turns Gay's remarks about having had it into an elliptical comment on their former harmony, and implicates herself, as well, in the tragic insight that nobody knows how to have it all, to experience the togetherness she and Gay have lost. In spite of her rage, there is compassion in her condemnation of the 3 dear, sweet dead men, with whom reconciliation is still possible. As Huston filmed it, the scene is deliberately awkward, since there is a sudden shift, a break in the action betokening a set piece, an unwieldy supplanting of the exciting chase sequence with Rosalind at the frame's center. Her speech ought to be redundant after so many speeches in this exceptionally talky movie. Yet her words work because they are fitted to the film of her Liff E213, a frame she is seen to form, however clumsily. And because, unlike all her previous dialogue, these words come up from the pit of suppressed resentment she barely manages to articulate. Her bent-over posture sug jests of being divided in two by male and female contentiousness, by love and hate of society, and by life and death. In projecting her profound sense of alienation to Gay, to his male companions, to men in general, and to the whole of existence, Rosalind is both triumphant and defeated. She is the ultimate cinematic embodiment of Monroe's double bind. Huston and Miller were uncertain about how to prepare for the final scenes between Rosalind and her male companions. Gable had not liked the original ending of the screenplay, in which Rosalind feels compassion for Gay, who remains on the lakebed defeated by the stallion. Huston, on the other hand, was concerned about clearing up what he perceived as vagueness in Guido's character. Frank Taylor wondered whether the screenwriter and the director still had the energy to create a proper ending. The final scene had gone through at least 3 revisions since March of 1960, and as of the first week of October, there were rumors of still more changes, with one version of the ending awarding Rosalind to Perse. When Monroe finally had the opportunity to read the scene that made Guido Rosalind's ex-lover, she became hysterical, for it threw the whole picture out of key. She told Paula Strasberg. Gable, who had the contractual authority to reject script alterations, agreed, and Monroe's supporters felt vindicated. Later, Miller conceded that Gable's judgment was sounder than his own. In the end, Miller was satisfied that he had achieved the appropriate close to the misfits, and Gable concurred. Gay conquers the stallion. Perse has cut loose in deference to Rosalind's feelings, but then Gay frees the stallion and makes his peace with Rosalind. Gable felt his character was not broken, but had acknowledged the necessity of finding another way of life. Miller thought Gay and Rosalind had compromised and recognized reality. Gay would have to come to terms with a settled existence and face the struggle between a personal code and social cooperation. Rose Lynn would have to accept the violence in all of us that existed side by side with love. This couple would not live happily ever after, but a certain balance had been achieved in their relationship with each other. Monroe could not accept the logic of the picture because it had not shown the violence in her. She was made to stand too far apart from the men who worshipped her. She did not regard the film in the harmonious terms Huston and Miller had confected. She never cited it as an example the film of her life E214 of having reached a crossroads in a dramatic part, the way she tentatively regarded Some Like It Hot as a significant achievement in comedy. Before filming The Misfits, she quarreled with Miller about his screenplay. After shooting it, she complained about Huston's tampering with the writer's words. Many viewers of The Misfits come away from it feeling the ending has somehow been tacked on, that the troubling ambiguities of Rosalind's relationship with Gay, with the other male characters, and with the world at large have been evaded, even sentimentalized. The ending is also a beginning, however, since Rosalind and Gay have reached a fuller consciousness that precludes seeing them in absolute, unchanging terms. We see them only in frontal shots and only inside the truck, Nick Barbaro points out. The effect emphasizes moving on, trying to find their way home, not riding off into the sunset to live happily ever after. No doubt this was Miller's and Huston's intention, but Gable's utter calm and sureness, and the romantic aura of twilight that bathes him in Monroe, mitigates the sobriety of Miller's outlook and Huston's shot selection. Barbaro successfully shows that the end is not just an affected appendage, but he discounts too heavily the way these movie stars radiate in their roles, making the final frames of The Misfits verge on cinema cliché. In late October, when The Misfits was nearly completed, Monroe told Miller to get out, which he proceeded to do with the help of Monroe's secretary, May Rise, Frank Taylor, and his aide, Edward Perrone. In early November, Monroe became hysterical and incoherent when a reporter called her with news of Gable's death. Rise, Rupert Allen, Patricia Newcomb, and frequently Joe DiMaggio helped her through the next shaky weeks. Allen had recommended Newcomb to Monroe when he was not able to accompany his distraught friend to New York City. Newcomb supervised the Monroe household, screening calls, and generally insulating the actress after the announcement of her separation from Miller. In late December and early January, she sorted out her allegiances, making up a new will that included her half-sister, Bernice Miracle, who she did not know well but with whom she nevertheless felt family-like. The will also acknowledged May Rise, now much more than an appointment secretary. Rise had become a trusted advisor of exceptional tact and discretion. Monroe felt some ambivalence about Paula Strasberg, probably because Paula, like Natasha Lydes, had become too visible in aggressively championing her charge, and somewhat stifling for a young woman suspicious of those who came to her aid too readily. Monroe, the film of her life E215, had been generous with Paula, supplying not only a good salary but several gifts. So it was Lee, more instrumental in nurturing the actress's talent, but circumspectly distant from the actual conditions of her employ meant on movie sets, who was to receive apart her estate and personal belongings. The everyday business of living defeated Monroe, as she attempted to put her end in order. She was back on heavy doses of Nembutal, even pricking the capsules with a pin for faster effect. As Rupert Allen observed, she made no secret of her pill habit or of her craving for oblivion. Pat Newcomb noticed her employer's fascination with the murky depths of New York Harbor one day and moved close enough to reach out in case of emergency. Monroe spent listless days, only rarely visiting the Strasberg apartment, the source of so much of her inspiration. On January 20, 1961, in the company of her attorney, Aaron Frosch, and Pat Newcomb, Monroe flew to Juarez, Mexico, to obtain her divorce from Miller, a sad public acknowledgement of her dashed hopes on the very day the country inaugurated a new leader. Pat Newcomb and John Springer, who had been handling Monroe's publicity on the East Coast since early 1959, selected the date in hopes that President Kennedy would get all the headlines. If Monroe was to survive, she had to find new interests. Miller had opened up the world of politics to her, and she became attuned to all the talk about the new direction signaled by the presidential election. During the making of The Misfits, as cast and crew followed the presidential debates on television, Monroe told W.J. Weatherby that she wanted to see Kennedy win because of Nixon's association with the whole red baiting scene. She may have met Kennedy as early as 1951 in the campaign of Charles Feldman, one of her agents with close connections to the Kennedy family. Her admiration and affection for Kennedy grew as Adlai Stevenson's supporters failed to secure his nomination at the Democratic Convention. She watched the inaugural during a 2-hour layover in Dallas on her way to Mexico. She was already responding to the Kennedy charisma, to the novelty of a political figure with the glamour of a movie star. Many people were expecting to participate in an unusual administration, in a new frontier that had all the glitter usually attributed to Hollywood. Just as she had missed her moment of rebirth in the Misfits and dropped precipitously into the worst depression of her life, Monroe was storing up energy for one more ascension by reaching out to the society outside herself, to the future that Kennedy represented. Chapter 13, The Lady of Shalott, December 1960 to August 1962, and moving through a mirror clear that hangs before her all the year, shadows of the world appear. In a series of intermittent discussions with W.J. Weatherby in New York from late 1960 to sometime in January 1961, Monroe latched onto his phrase, a pattern of selves, to argue against the idea of a single self persisting through an entire lifetime. She favored fragmentary changing natures. In his presence, her moods changed quickly. Her contradictoriness and fatiguing awareness of her divided feelings were driving her toward collapse and hospitalization. Weatherby sensed she was struggling to control herself. One time, in the bar they used for their talks, Monroe appeared tentative, nervous, and rather distant, and sloppily dressed. As she had with Margaret Parton, who interviewed her in mid-March of 1961, Monroe skirted her past, refusing to discuss her childhood rape story. But she did reveal her mirror obsession. I sit in front of the mirror for hours looking for signs of age. She was attracted to old people, to the sense of completion age may bring. I want to grow old without facelifts. They take the life out of a face, the character. I want to have the courage to be loyal to the face I've made. In the next breath, however, she conceded that sometimes it would be easier to avoid old age. She claimed control over the depiction of her person. When the photographers come, it's like looking into a mirror. They think they arrange me to suit themselves, but I use them to put over myself. But how much character did she have, the Lady of Shalott 217, she wondered, when she was killing the truth by killing photographs harmful to her public image? Was she in charge of her body, or simply infatuated with it? She was not sure. Compared to the beauty that could be perpetuated in a stage career, her attractiveness on screen seemed ephemeral. You can go on forever in the theater. The distance, the footlights, the makeup, it all helps to create whatever illusion you wish. In their last few meetings, Weatherby detected a new strain in Monroe's demeanor, perhaps anxious anticipation of the mixed reception the Misfits would indeed receive. In early February, when he mentioned a Steinbeck character who commits suicide, she seemed to draw back in her seat, asking why the character did it, and admitting she had tried to kill herself once and was kinda disappointed it didn't work. She looked depressed and worried she did not have what it takes to carry out her plans. She was afraid to be alone. She showed up at their final meeting with unwashed hair and a faint body odor. All worked up, she aggressively maintained a person's privilege to commit suicide. I don't believe it's a sin or a crime, although it doesn't get you anywhere, she said in reaction to Hemingway's suicide. She found it hard to trust people, to see that she had made any progress in her life. She speculated about a weak-minded quality inherited from her mother and appeared confused, embarrassed, and tired, almost totally enveloped in self-doubt and doped up with sleeping pills. The winter of 1961 was a bleak season for Marilyn Monroe. The lilt was gone from her blurred and weakened voice, and she was more depressed than Norman Roston had ever known her to be. Often she was heavily sedated, or in a state of high nervous tension. She saw few friends and put herself, it seemed, at considerable remove from the world. By early February, she was on the verge of total collapse and agreed with Dr. Chris's decision to hospitalize her. Dr. Chris accompanied her patient to the Payne Whitney Clinic in New York, without explaining that it was a mental institution. Monroe supposed it would be like other hospitals, to which she had retired for secluded rest. Much later, Dr. Chris admitted to Ralph Roberts it had been a terrible mistake sending her patient to Payne Whitney, for Monroe immediately panicked. A nurse present during Monroe's admission to the hospital ward recalled for Richard Merriman how Monroe froze when she heard the grim snap of a lock closing behind her. She stood there endlessly repeating, "Open that door. Just open that door. I won't make any trouble, just let me out. Please, open that door." A letter she the lad die of Charlotte T. 218 hurriedly wrote to the Strasburgs emphasized her desperate circumstances. "You haven't heard from me because I'm locked up with all these poor nutty people. I'm sure to end up a nut if I stay in this nightmare. Please help me, Lee. This is the last place I should be. Maybe if you called Dr. Chris and assured her of my sensitivity and that I must get back to class, so I'll be better prepared for Rain, the Somerset Maugham play planned for television production with Strasburg as director. P.S. Forgive the spelling, and there's nothing to write on here. On the dangerous floor, it's like a cell. Can you imagine? Cement blocks. They put me in here because they lied to me about my calling my doctor and Joe DiMaggio, and they had the bathroom door locked, so I broke the glass, and outside of that, I haven't done anything to be uncooperative." With her family's history of mental illness, it is not surprising that Monroe was frightened and resistant. According to Roston, she became exasperated with a young doctor who kept asking her why she was so unhappy. In anger, she struck back. "I've been paying the best doctors a fortune to find out why, and you're asking me?" To Alan Levy, she denied rumors of disrobing and playing other scenes of high drama in the hospital. She laughed and said she wished she had done so just to get something out of her system. She was proud of having told the staff to have their heads examined. She later told Patricia Newcomb if they were going to treat her like a nut, she would behave like one. The letters she wrote to the Strasburgs and to Ralph Greenson demonstrate that no matter her distress, she had not lost her ability to observe her own behavior. Indeed, it is clear she modeled some of her actions on her performance in Don't Bother to Knock. But the line between her acting and her own experience remained blurred. In 3 days, she was out of Payne Whitney, thanks to the help of Joe DiMaggio. She was moved to Columbia Presbyterian Hospital, where she spent nearly 3 weeks withdrawing from her pill habit. She recuperated at home in New York, followed up on her plans to do Rain on television, and granted an interview to Margaret Parton, who wrote an admiring, sensitive profile rejected by the Ladies' Home Journal because its editors believed the journalist had been mesmerized by her subject. The Lady of Shaw Lot 219, it was typical of Monroe to come out of her deepest depressions and hysterical episodes full of vigor and intelligence, and just as typical for her renewal to be greeted with skepticism. When NBC refused to accept Lee Strasberg as her director, he had no experience in television. Monroe canceled plans for Rain and accepted Di Maggio's invitation to join him in Florida in late March. The change of scene refreshed her, and she was able to see her half-sister, Bernice Miracle. Naturally, the press buzzed about the resumption of a Monroe-DiMaggio romance, but the couple called themselves just friends. As she had done with Miller, Monroe needed to draw on Di Maggio's strength. As Norman Roston would have it, Essie gravitated toward power. This type of stern figure gives you security and absolution. Rejuvenated, she returned to New York to resume her career. Even so, March and April were not easy months for Monroe. On March 9, she was photographed in a black mink, leaving the funeral of Arthur Miller's mother, with whom she had remained close after the divorce. This was a death in the family for Monroe, as she indicated by tacking a seat with the Millers at the services. After returning from Florida, she was shattered by a press report that Clark Gable's wife, Kay, had said, "The Misfits helped to kill him, but it wasn't the physical exertion that did it. It was the waiting. According to Skalski, Monroe took Kay Gable's remarks to be an indirect reference to her tardiness on the set. Rupert Allen, who was in especially close contact with Monroe during this period, says Kay Gable told him she never made the critical statement and that she remained a friend of Monroe's after her husband's death, even inviting the actress to the christening of Clark Gable's son. In any case, Gable's death afflicted the actress with great guilt, both Weth Irby and Skalski report. The latter recalls her asking, "Was I punishing my father, getting even for all the years he kept me waiting?" She was feeling suicidal, and friends persuaded her to close up her New York apartment temporarily. In the late spring of 1961, she flew to Hollywood to rest and to diet in preparation for a gallbladder operation scheduled for late June in New York City. In California, under the supervision of Dr. Hyman Engelberg, her internist and Dr. Greenson, who took over complete responsibility for her psychiatric care. She began in mid-July the agonizing process of putting her life back together. From the spring to the autumn of 1961, Monroe made little progress. Greenson had earlier noted symptoms of paranoia and depressive reaction. Now he observed signs of schizophrenia. In May, he wrote to A. the Ladai of Charlotte T. 220 colleague that Monroe was still trying to escape into the drugs or get involved with very destructive people who will engage in some sort of sadomasochistic relationship with her. He was apparently referring to Frank Sinatra and his Las Vegas friends, whose parties she frequented. Greenson wrote like a disapproving father, referring to the actress as an adolescent girl who needs guidance, friendliness, and firmness. Although Monroe said she relied on Greenson, this did not prevent her, in Greenson's words, from canceling several hours to go to Palm Springs with Mr. F.S. She is unfaithful to me as one is to a parent. At the same time, Monroe became frightened, almost terrorized, by her father's attempt to communicate with her, feeling that it was too late to hear from him. She hardened herself against his second effort to reach her. In these 6 months, she began to see signs of aging and worried about flabby breasts, stretch marks, the beginnings of crow's feet, and brown spots on her hands. Some of this deterioration can be glimpsed in Bert Stearns' photographs. From Marjorie Stengel, employed as Monroe's secretary during this period, Mailer draws a picture of his subject's aimlessness. She was uncommunicative and in disarray, rising late, wandering about her New York apartment in a slightly soiled nightie, and spending a long time on the phone with Dr. Greenson. Her apartment was nondescript, except for a mirror on the ceiling, her major touch, Mailer calls it. In the living room, all was white. Walls, rug, piano, couch, transparent leaves in a vase. Even a Cecil Beaton photograph showed her in a white gown. This is the white dream home described in my story, the one Gladys promised but could not deliver to her daughter. Except for Joe DiMaggio, friends did not visit. Across the continent, in November of 1961, Eunice Murray saw Monroe in another apartment, emerging from her 6-month ordeal. Dr. Greenson helped her withdraw from barbiturates, and his patient now seemed ready for more independence after months of round-the-clock nursing care. Murray, who was to serve the actress, with Greenson's encouragement in several capacities, was immediately fascinated by a raw Diane Monroe, without makeup, and in every way different from the drab described by her secretary, Marjorie Stengel. Only the bedroom, with huge floor-to-ceiling mirrors, linked Monroe's Los Angeles and New York lives. In the last year of her life, Monroe traveled between New York and Hollywood without surcease, as if her identity were indeed bilocated. Evidence can be compiled to demonstrate that now she meant New York, the lady of Shaw Lot 221, now Hollywood, to be her home. She was of two worlds. Most of her friends in one realm had little knowledge of her friends in the other, for she usually liked to segregate her intimates. Anthony Summers traces just how complicated she made her life by swinging between circles of friends in show business, politics, and perhaps, through Sinatra, the mafia. Consequently, radically different impressions of her personality and plans, of her commitment to the East and West Coasts, and to the stage and the screen, were common among her friends and acquaintances, who were perhaps not fully aware of how much Monroe tended to act the chameleon, to play up or play down her connections to the Kennedys and other famous figures. Monroe attempted to pattern life after her psychiatrist's suggestions. By late 1961, for Dr. Greenson, Marilyn was both patient and ever-present family friend. Summers notes, she took great offense at the slightest irritation on his part, for, in his own words, he had become one of those ideal figures in her life from whom she expected perfection. By February of 1962, she found a house, similar in style to his own, and was trying out his idea of a stable, rooted existence. With Murray's help, the actress began slowly to furnish and remodel her home. A trip to Mexico, where she purchased furniture and other items for her household, concentrated her mind wonderfully. Murray remembered that her employer was particularly interested in meeting politicians, and actually preferred doing so to invitations to meet members of the artistic community. Fred Field, an American expatriate living in Mexico, saw a great deal of Monroe, She had come with an introduction to him from mutual friends in Connecticut, and remembers her vet meant support for civil rights for blacks and for the government in China, and her anger at all forms of red baiting. Edgar Hoover was singled out as an object of hatred, judging by her conversations with Weatherby, by her comments on politics in portions of the Life interview that were not printed, and by the material in her FBI file. Monroe looked to the Kennedys to set things right. They would finally bring about a more just world of equal opportunity for the abused and for abandoned minority ties, among whom Monroe counted herself. Greenson observed that she could not seem to survive without these heroic examples in her life. In the spring of 1962, the Rostons, visiting Monroe in Los Angeles, were invited to the Greenson home, where Norman immediately sensed his friend's complete relaxation. With his patient's consent, Dr. Greenson described in general terms his treatment of her. He told Roston that the lad died of Charlotte T. 222, she was some years away from becoming an analytic patient, even though she needed psychotherapy, both supportive and analytical. He encouraged her familiarity with his family in order to supply the attachment she had been lacking from childhood onward. To some biographers, such as Donald Spoto, Greenson's unorthodox measures, which obliterated the traditional boundaries between therapist and patient, were reckless and actually weakened any effort Monroe might have made to strengthen her sense of independence. But Monroe, it seems to me, was skillful in her ability to manipulate Greenson and all of her therapists, and nothing in her biography suggests that she herself could conceive of an alternative to the psychiatrist's care. As Greenson explained to Morris Zolito in 1973, he was taking a desperate measure because previous forms of therapy had failed. It seems likely that Monroe was suffering from what Greenson, in a paper published in 1958, called a defective formation of the self-image, an identity disorder that explained why she was not ready for psychoanalysis. He may have regarded her as one of his screen patients, although he does not identify her by name in any of his writings. A screen patient is anxious about how well he or she communicates. Like such patients, Monroe seemed warm and giving, ready to recite her life history, despite anxiety or shame. She had been successful, yet she belittled her accomplishments. In spite of her talent, her productivity had been sporadic and unreliable. Like other screen patients, she was unduly concerned about her popularity and her ability to entertain, prone to severe mood swings and exhibitionism, yet chronically optimistic about her career. Enthusiastic and sentimental, impressionable, suggestible, even gullible, she tended to exaggerate to the point of lying, almost like a swindler, although she was sensitive, perceptive, and empathic. In fact, like Greenson's other screen patients, she was psychologically minded and could spontaneously arrive at important insights, but had great difficulty in integrating those new insights effectively. Monroe evidently followed a pattern that Greenson detected in his other screen patients. She developed a strong, positive transference. This technical term, about which Greenson published a great deal, describes the process by which the patient becomes irrevocably committed to the analyst and sometimes morbidly dependent on him. In its first stages, transference can be remarkably helpful because, as in Monroe's case, the patient is eager to rebuild her life along the lines the analyst suggests. Unfortunately, in its later stages, transference can thwart the Lady of Shaw Lot 223 resolution of neurotic conflicts, because patients identify totally with the analyst and lash out at others, displaying, in Greenson's words, a markedly different set of character traits at work and at home, with their fam wily or with strangers. Monroe would demonstrate this kind of irrational, contradictory behavior when she began work. In the late spring of 1962, on Something's Got to Give, like other screen patients, she was not able to assimilate or clearly comprehend her past. Almost all the important people of their past lives are remembered as essentially black or white figures. This rather disturbed relationship to time promotes a blurring of past and present, with the past remaining so alive in patients' minds that they project a youthful quality, and their self-picture is many years younger than their chronological age. In movies, Monroe was screened in precisely this way. That is, she was literally screened or blocked off from her true age, from a character, who should have been maturing. Just like other screen patients, Monroe's characters had to be created anew. Off the screen, as well, each phase of her life was conceived as a beginning, not a continuation of what was already in place. Screen patients, Greenson points out, have to feel fresh and have the ability to awaken new hopes. But since such personalities cannot be old and cannot be seen to carry a past with them, they are essentially suspended in a nowhere, like sugar cane, whose behavior can be compared to the imperative, urgent, and repetitive quality Greenson identified in screen patients. Screen patients feel favored, like the lucky ones, and exhibit feelings of omnipotence and expansiveness. This occurs in moments of triumph or in rage. At other times, as in Monroe's Lost Day, with the Montans, their megalomania may manifest itself as monumental self-punishment with which no one may interfere. Their reason for such drastic psychic alternation, Greenson submits, is that these people confuse the wish to be favorites with the feeling that they are the favorites. Frequently, such people change their names, undergo plastic surgery, and, in general, hold themselves together by manufacturing self-gratifying visions of their appearance as substitutions for deprivations in childhood associated with their mothers as unreliable givers. To feel intact, they must be looked at as though they were on stage. At home, where nobody could see her, the actress might not be able to put herself together very well. Greenson wrote to a colleague. Monroe, he pointed out, thrived on the public perception of her as a beautiful woman, perhaps the most beautiful woman in the world. He concludes, whereas the ordinary patient comes to anal the lad die of Shallot T224 Ussies because he does not like who he is, these patients come to analysis to find out who they really are. Such language echoes Monroe's confessions of self-doubt, from My Story to her last recorded interview for Life. By the time Something's Got to Give went into full production on April 23, 1962, the actress was facing a lifetime of failed enthusiasms. Although Something's Got to Give, 1962, the Lady of Shaw Lot 225, both Dr. Greenson and Mrs. Murray, acting now as the actress's housekeeper, believed she was making significant progress, she felt profoundly ambivalent about going back to work. She had not been able to cope well with her buried paranoia, feelings of persecution, frustration, and rage. It is not as if she avoided dealing with her traumatic memories. Instead, such memories, as Greenson says of other screen patients, may serve a screening function for a more severe trauma the patient is somehow powerless to get at. Monroe did take certain measures that might relieve her anxieties about her role. Before the shooting date, she consulted Nunnally John's son, who was writing the script, a remake of a 1940 comedy, My Favorite Wife, starring Cary Grant and Irene Dunne. Johnson had worked on How to Marry a Millionaire and were not married. Her first words to him, "Have you been trapped into this too?" were a fair indication of her distrust of the studio and of her suspicion of any project it might propose. She was fulfilling her commitment to Fox, negotiated during Milton Green's tenure as her business partner, and it is unlikely she felt inspired by her role. Dr. Engelberg was treating her for a viral infection she may have picked up in Mexico. Her energy level was low, but it rose immediately, stimulated by Johnson's assurance that he had chosen to write the screenplay rather than accept other projects offered to him. When she realized he was not talking to her merely out of a sense of obligation, she became enthusiastic about the film, exploring questions of casting and plot development. He was so taken with her sharp perceptions, he regretted every harsh word he ever said against her and became her unabashed admirer. Monroe's main worry then became the director, George Cukor, who told Johnson how much he loathed Monroe. He had directed her in the lame Let's Make Love, and he was on her list of approved directors. He owed Fox a picture, and so did Monroe. Cukor seemed to want to make the best of it. According to his biographer, Patrick McGilligan, Cukor vowed, "It's gonna work. We're gonna do it." When Cukor began to revise the script, his actions were tantamount to challenging Monroe's hard-won convictions, for this was a script she could believe in. The revisions were an attack upon her, especially since, according to Johnson, Cukor had similarly sabotaged her performance in Let's Make Love. Cukor, who had suffered the trauma of being fired as director of Gone with the Wind, always made pleasing the studio his priority. And the studio wanted to get a picture, any picture, out of Mon the Ladai of Shallot T226 Row as soon as possible, figuring that her reign as sex symbol was about to expire. As she reached the age of retirement that ended Betty Grable's career nearly a decade earlier, the studio did nothing to allay Monroe's doubts about script changes that arrived almost daily. Walter Bernstein, the last of 6 writers to work on Something's Got to Give, recalls that the studio catered to Monroe's every whim. She complained that the script had her chasing a man, when just the reverse should be true in a Marilyn Monroe movie. But why should this have been a surprise? It was the same for Cary Grant, and for other leading men and women, who realized that as stars they should only take roles in which they were pursued. Bernstein, who was plainly disgusted with Monroe, does not see that after Johnson's departure, she regarded all changes as assaults on her personal integrity. Consequently, she took every opportunity to make her image immaculate. Once her artistic vision of the film was violated, she reacted like a politician or a general, making sure her power remained intact. Sometimes she would refer to herself in the third person, like Caesar. "Remember, you've got Marilyn Monroe," she said to Bernstein when she wanted to wear a bikini in one scene. "You've got to use her," she instructed the screenwriter. Such comments reveal how difficult it was for the actress to jettison her screen personality. If Fox would not use it properly, she would find other ways to get the attention she deserved. On Friday, May 18, she traveled to New York to sing "Happy Birthday" to President Kennedy on Saturday evening. She promised to return to work Monday. She considered her appearance in Madison Square Garden a command performance. Giles states that it caused her considerable anxiety is apparent in the taped, but not published transcript of her life interview. In a paper published in 1974, Dr. Greenson, identifying Monroe only as an emotionally immature young woman patient who had developed a very dependent transference to me, mentions her major concern about the period of my absence to attend an international congress in Europe was a public appearance of great importance to her profession ally. She felt the event ratified her existence and defined her both as a star and as one of the people, as she put in the life interview. By singing to the people, she was singing to herself, to her fantasy of watching herself at center stage from way above, under one of those rafters, close to the ceiling. In fact, film of her during the Madison Square Garden event shows her shielding her eyes with her hands, which act as a visor, but also as a kind of salute to the audience in the rafters, where she was the lady of Shaw Lot 227 placing herself. Marilyn Monroe, she was demonstrating, was everyone's dream of democratic success. In the tape-recorded life interview, she can be heard, again and again, marveling that the sound of her voice did get out. It is as if the child in her feared some stifling of the sexy birthday song she had practiced for weeks, sometimes in the presence of Ralph Roberts and others, and planned for in elaborate fittings of a skin-tight dress, with hundreds of strategically placed brilliants that shimmered and glittered so brightly that the body was clothed in reflected light. This last description by Mrs. Murray, who helped the actress with her wardrobe, is reminiscent of the studio's description of Monroe's outfit, for there's no business like show business. It is also similar to the outfit the studio decided not to use in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, because of Monroe's flamboyant sexual display at an awards ceremony, and the flaunting of her femme fatale appeal in Niagara. The times had changed, or rather, the times had caught up with Marilyn Monroe, and she could now show herself in her own production. The scene of her singing to JFK is often reproduced in documentaries side by side with excerpts from her movies. For the scene was directed to Happy Birthday, Mr. President, May 18, 1962. The Ladai of Charlotte T. 228 play for the screen. After Peter Lawford's joking introduction of the late Marilyn Monroe and her delayed entrance, she glides forward with small steps, adjusting her fur wrap as she approaches Lawford. With one arm, she covers her shoulders with the stole and smiles, bringing the fur closer to her neck as she greets him. She flicks a finger at the microphone, then grabs it with her hand, raises her arms and hands, forming that visor in the bright lights which is also her own framing device, as she puts the audience into the picture of her life. Languidly and suggestively, she begins to sing, thus inspiring Kennedy's subsequent joke about retiring from politics now that Miss Monroe had sung Happy Birthday to him in such a wholesome way. She starts a second chorus of the song by shifting out of her seductive pose, vigorously waving her arms like a conductor, and jumping up and down on the stage like the president's most enthusiastic cheerleader. As in a classic Marilyn Monroe movie, the performance is as innocent as it is seductive. Politics and show business, on this night, were more closely allied than ever before in American life. After all, the birthday salute, as it is called in an advertisement extolling the most exciting program ever staged, included a spectacular array of the world's greatest talent. The actress craved this kind of attention, and her association with the Kennedys completed an ambitious profile of herself initiated by her marriage to DiMaggio and confirmed by her marriage to Miller. She was the screen actress as politician, situating her image in the public's eye and allying herself with an administration that prided itself on its high production values. As with Greenson's other screen patients, Monroe's life had to have a high gloss, and the Kennedys, with their Hollywood connections, fit comfortably into her endless efforts to polish her image. John Kennedy reveled in Hollywood gossip, and his brother Robert was interested in movie personalities like Monroe and Judy Garland. Their father, Joseph, had once been active in Hollywood film production, and their sister Pat was married to Peter Lawford. The Lawfords, who lived nearby, became friends of Monroe's, and the actress would see the Kennedys on social occasions. They enjoyed her wit and seemed bothered very little by the gossip that linked her sexually with both John and Robert. And while Monroe felt complimented by being invited into their company, she was also drawn to Robert's commitment to civil rights and political freedom. The Kennedys were important to the actress because they represented a stage on which to perform that was so much greater than what her current film offered. The Lady of Shaw Lot 229 rejuvenated by her Madison Square Garden performance on May 21. She returned to the set of Something's Got to Give and sparkled in scenes with Wally Cox and Dean Martin. In discarded footage, Cukors voiced the set of Something's Got to Give, 1962. The Lady of Shalott T 230 can be heard calling on her to do take after take in scenes that show no deterioration in her timing or in her patient repetition of lines that are part of the wear and tear of movie-making. None of the surviving footage supports Cukors' claim that Monroe acted in a kind of slow motion that made the director say he did not believe she could complete the picture. On the contrary, her vitality is apparent in the impromptu nude swimming scene, in which Monroe shed her flesh-colored suit and frolicked in a pool as if to enliven the film's hackneyed plot, and to remind the world of her nude calendar work, now that she was again the 119-pound beauty she had been 16 years earlier. She realized that photographs of this scene would seize the attention of the world press, and at least momentarily shift attention away from the extraordinary attention focused on Elizabeth Taylor's romance with Richard Burton during the making of Cleopatra. That Fox did not realize how much the free publicity helped to promote the studio, and its picture is astounding. Monroe appeared on magazine covers around the world, momentarily obliterating the press's obsession with the Taylor-Burton affair. Lawrence Schiller writes in Marilyn and Me that Monroe's deal with him to publish his nude shots of her included the proviso that none of the magazines using his work could also carry a story about Taylor and Burton. But such triumphs were short-lived. As Arthur Miller observes in Time Bends, there was something sad and alarming about Monroe's resort to nudity, which seemed a desperate move, not a triumph. She seems to have realized as much when Schiller found her resistant to Hugh Hefner's proposal that she do more nude work for Playboy involving a kind of peekaboo sequence designed for both the front and back covers of the magazine. Visiting Monroe in late May, Roston found her edgy and irritable. When they made a visit to Greenson's home, the actress was abrupt and even belligerent with the psychiatrist, goading him to interpret a Rodin statue of two lovers she had just purchased. Her voice was shrill and strident, and she repeatedly asked the analyst to tell her what the statue meant. Was the man screwing the woman, or was it a fake? Her interpretation seemed to reflect her own ambivalence. Look at them both. How beautiful. He's hurting her, but he wants to love her too. Monroe's words call to mind Greenson's correspondence with a colleague, in which he identified her inability to cope with any sort of hurt as one of the decisive factors that led to her death. Did the statue reflect a gap in herself, what Alexander Lowen calls a break in the personality, which fixates the individual at a certain pattern, the Lady of Shaw Lot 231 of behavior he cannot change? What cannot get changed gets repeated. Monroe's actions recall Freud's use of the term repetition compulsion to describe the personality's return to the situation where it got stuck, in the hopes of someday getting unstuck. Monroe was losing patience and approaching the despair of many patients who cannot help themselves and do not see therapy providing the relief it initially promised. By June 1, Greenson had left for Europe, and Roston had returned home to Brooklyn. Owing to Monroe's demands on him, the psychiatrist was perilously close to admitting defeat. When she threatened to fall back wholly on drugs, his sessions with her would last 4 or 5 hours. Summers reports. Greenson confessed to having become a prisoner of a form of treatment that I thought was correct for her, but almost imposed Sybil for me. In a later letter, he confided to a friend that, at times I felt I couldn't go on with this. Sick again, Monroe missed several shooting days on Something's Got to Give. Bernstein suggests she was not the studio's idea of a star, sprightly and sexy and full of fun. By the middle of June, the studio had fired her, and she spent the next few days first crying, then in a stupor, and finally angrily defiant. Cukor claimed that she could not be directed. Wyu couldn't reach her, she was like underwater. But Monroe had acted this way with other directors she deemed unsympathetic. Perhaps the most telling refutation came from Dean Martin, who refused to do the picture with Lee Remick, Monroe's replacement. He had signed to do the movie with Marilyn Monroe, and as far as Martin was concerned, she was irreplaceable. In truth, as Donald Spoto documents, the studio mismanaged its dealings with Monroe, and she, in turn, had to deal not only with a script that was changing daily, but with a studio administration that also changed owing to a corporate reshuffle, as Fox floundered with a huge budget overrun on Cleopatra and other bad business decisions. Eventually, Daryl Zanuck, who had departed the Fox lot to produce Motion Pictures in Europe, returned to take control of the corporation and to begin negotiations with Monroe to resume work on Something's Got to Give in September. Although Monroe seemed perfectly capable of rallying herself for her art and turning in a fine performance in yet another mediocre picture, she was also, in Rupert Allen's words, facing the dark tunnel of her career. There is no better authority on Monroe than Allen, who first met her when he was a young writer working on a profile of her for Look, and then became her publicist and confidant. He had watched her age, and the lad die of Charlotte T. 232, observed her need to make the transition to roles reflecting her maturing appearance and talent. She worked again at Actors Studio, this time on a one-act play, an adaptation of a short story by Colette. Once again, her sensitivity impressed the Strasbergs and others, and hopes were high for her stage career, until an unsettling mood sent her back to Dr. Greenson in California. In his view, she had come to identify with him as her white knight, her protector, her talisman serving to avert bad luck or evil. In his absence, he says she experienced the terror of a child who has lost her security blanket. In a final conversation with Weatherby, perhaps sometime in late June, Monroe seemed to be making plans to stay in California, more or less permanently. When he asked her about the Actors Studio, she shrugged in answer. In fact, she had written to Lee Strasberg proposing that he become part of a new production company she was thinking of organizing. No record of his answer has surfaced, but it is likely he knew all too well how that kind of proximity to Monroe would overwhelm him, as it had engulfed Milton Greene, Arthur Miller, Ralph Greenson, and others. Monroe told Weatherby that her psychiatrist advised her to concentrate on fun movies for the time being, and she teased the reporter about her affair with a famous married politician, even as she enthused about President Kennedy as another Lincoln, about whom she would brook no criticism. She should stick to the movie audience of millions, her politician friend advised her. Ralph Roberts is the key source for the claim that Monroe had sex with President Kennedy. According to Rob Ertz, the president himself spoke to the masseur on the phone while in a bedroom with the actress at Bing Crosby's home. Monroe, Roberts averred, had told Kennedy that the masseur could give him sound advice on how to manage his back problems. From late June to early August, the actress was under terrific stress, seeing Dr. Greenson almost every day and calling Ralph Roberts, sometimes in the middle of the night, for massages to relieve tension that had her saying, "I'm about to jump out of my skin." At the same time, George Barris's photographs of her, especially the shots of her on the beach, suggest a sturdy personality. In conversation with Richard Merriman and during photographic sessions with Bert Stern, she let go of more of herself, offering not just a reprise of her career, but articulating herself more precisely and creatively than ever before. If her persona demanded repetitions of her successful poses, so that she operated perilously close to cliché, it is remarkable how much energy remained for one more go at originality. The Lady of Sha Lot 233 Monroe's moods were mercurial, Stern recalled. His photographs most seemed to chart the rise and fall of her temperature, of the fever to create. Through Pat Newcomb, she requested that he have on hand 3 bottles of her favorite champagne, Dom Perignon, for the modeling assignment arranged by Vogue. He bought a whole case, and in the first séance on June 23, he kept shooting for 12 hours, which perhaps AC counts in part for the tired, even drunken look she wears in some of her poses. In one series, she seems narcotized in a playful happiness verging on melancholy. She puckers her lips, bites on a strand of pearls, part lie covers her mouth with her fingers, puts her hands around her head and neck while her eyelids drop. All of this framing of herself is done as though she were half-conscious, on the edge of an awakening or a very deep sleep. Monroe projects an identity that wavers between extreme states, even as she is in complete touch with her body. As Greenson put it in one of his letters, Teehee main mechanism she used to bring some feeling of stability and significance to her life was the attractiveness of her body. She had lost considerate weight, and her breasts are not nearly so prominent as in her 1950s heyday. It is as if a new decade has shifted concern to other aspects of her body, other areas of the self. The thinness of her shoulders, arms, face, and torso tones down the lushness exhibited in earlier poses. A la Milton Green, wisps of her mussed hair trail down her forehead, glance past her right eye, and make the left eye seem larger and clearer in a bifurcated Marilyn Monroe pose. Stern stimulated her taste for psychologically intriguing poses. She is wiry, taut, and sharp, but at the same time gauzy, available in outline only, as she covers her body with the transparent fabrics Stern supplied. In some of the photographs, she smiles broadly, allowing her upper gums and her facial wrinkles to show. The actress plays with a string of beads, clutching part of it to her breast with her left hand, while holding out another part of it with her extended right arm. This pose suggests an alternation between her introverted and extroverted impulses, played here for humor with a more honest edge than in Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend. Far more riveting and disturbing is the shot of Monroe with her fingers seemingly penetrating her forehead in great anguish, the tongue askew in her mouth. She seems about to let go or about to summon great concentration. As each new pose worked itself out, there was very little talking. W.E. would go a step higher, Stern says, echoing Montgomery Clift. One photograph resembles Monroe's bent-over screaming scene in the Ladai of Charlotte T. 234 Misfits. She drops her scarf for one glimpse, one stolen frame, out of a series of frames masking various parts of her body. In the fugitive frame, she looks convulsed and vulnerable, a slight figure, naked, not nude, with her traumas slipping out of her in a setting no longer squared off by the scarf. There is only the tense fabric of Monroe's own person, just as Bert Stern was impressed by how thoroughly the actress prepared for her last sitting. Richard Merriman marveled at her professionalism in her last interview. She asked to see his questions in advance, thought about them for days, and refused to essay any answer she had not pondered. He noted the excellent taste of the furnishings and artwork in her new house, and he responded enthusiastically to her keen intelligence. He saw her in many different guises: a sweet little girl, a low-key hysteric, frightened and not convinced of her abilities, and a perceptive critic of her own work and that of others. Most important of all, however, was her skill at presenting an ideal Monroe. She turned her best side to him, he was sure, going about the interview in a mature, systematic manner. She was pleased with the edited tape, which she saw in print 2 days before her death. Her conversation with Merriman is the closest she came to a final testament. He ended the interview feeling somewhat troubled about her seclusion, in which her home functioned as a bulwark. She chose it for its privacy. It was at the end of a cul-de-sac, and sometimes she gave the impression of retreating behind its high walls. Like the last months of her life, Monroe's last days are filled with contradictory evidence about her physical and mental health. In Marilyn and Me, Lawrence Schiller presents her as a consummate professional, carefully selecting his nude swimming scene photographs for publication. For him, her death would seem unaccountable and surely an accident. Merriman recalled that she looked terrific, but when examined closely, her skin was pasty and lifeless-looking, and her hair had no body to it, like hair that has been primped and heated and blown 1,000 times. Her face was kind of cardboardy. She was not sleeping well, and she was under constant psychiatric care. Her final hours, from some time around 7:30 p.m. until about 3:30 a.m., August 5, when her lifeless body was discovered, are open to endless speculation, even though the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office found no reason to doubt the original finding of probable suicide as the result of a drug overdose. Pills that, for the longest time, failed to supply her with enough sleep now disoriented her. In the past, she had built up great tolerance for massive doses, but recently she had been able to get along with fewer sedatives. Perhaps she, the lady of Shaw Lot 235, misjudged how much her body could absorb on an empty stomach. She was not drinking, and her death was nothing so simple as an accidental overdose. It was, rather, part of a pattern of self-abuse and self-absorption that she could not overcome. At her most fragmented moments, she inhabited, like the Lady of Shaw Lot, an intensely private domain, full of a personal mythology, impenetrable to the outsider, even to her psychiatrist perhaps, if one is to judge by her poem that prefaces Rostand's reminiscence of her. It is about a rootless child with a doll in a carriage that goes over the cracks that break a mother's back, traveling far away from home. The child in the poem comforts her doll. "Don't cry / I hold you and rock you to sleep." But the poem ends with a plea for help, as the child feels life coming closer / when all I want is to die. The child and the adult vie for attention as the actress attempts to become her own mother, to give herself the feeling of a mother. The mother she never had, the mother who died, more than once, inside of her. As in the lives of many suicides, a terrible isolation enclosed Monroe's every move. An isolation that was broken by attempts to escape from past failures, by assuming glorious roles and dwelling on the grand possibilities of the future. There was a feverish desperation in her plans, a fluctuation between physical vanity and self-injury, and an outlandish mixture of the profound and the trivial that, in Leslie Farber's view, is a common characteristic of the suicide. Much has been made of telephone logs, showing that Monroe called the Justice Department several times during her final days. Read biographer Anthony Summers, and you may believe that the brevity of those calls exacerbated Monroe's feeling that she was a woman spurned. Read Donald Spoto, and you will have the impression that Robert Kennedy simply did not have the time any longer to indulge Monroe's questions about his work, even though in more relaxed circumstances he had entertained her with answers. One does not have to believe in murder conspiracies to see that at the slightest provocation, this woman, with her fragile psyche, would begin to feel abused by the Kennedys, and resentful that she could no longer share the spotlight with them. Monroe's reliance on drugs to alleviate anxiety made her less and less capable of resuming her search for a sound identity and a substantial role. Temporary stimulants debilitated her, and she could not find the natural dynamic of her life. It became impossible to cope with the frustrations of her career without the lift or the tranquility provided by her the Ladai of Shalott T 236 pills. Under such circumstances, the will becomes paralyzed, and the whole personality is susceptible to exhaustion, derangement, and depleting illnesses. She seemed caught between her ragged endings and beginnings, and divided by disturbing and contrary impulses. Fragmentary notes to herself suggest she was stymied and sometimes even angry with herself. She could not sustain a loving relationship with a man. She felt less than a whole woman. Some found the actress too fey, like the fairy lady of Shalott, laboring under a curse, weaving a magic web around herself that was certain to be unraveled by reality. George Cukor called her death a nasty business. Her worse rejection, power and money in the end, she was too innocent. He was apparently referring to the rumors, already rampant, about her affairs with both John and Robert Kennedy. Dr. Greenson, who publicly denied that his patient was involved with either Kennedy, nevertheless told a member of the suicide team investigating her death that on her last evening she sounded drugged and depressed, because her meeting with one of the very important people she had been seeing was canceled. He also noted that she had found it gratifying to have a close relationship with extremely important men in government. The relationship was sexual, and the men concerned were at the highest level. Dr. Robert Littman, the suicide team member to whom Greenson gave his report, told biographer Anthony Summers that it was clear Greenson was referring to the Kennedys, although they were not named, perhaps, as another suicide team member suggests, because discretion entered into it. Greenson had been concerned about Monroe's romantic involvement, but did not feel he could oppose it so long as it supplied such a badly needed sense of her own importance. On her last night, she was feeling let down. The most beautiful woman in the world, she told her psychiatrist, did not have a date. She was feeling rejected by some of the people she had been close to, Greenson concluded. Sooner or later Monroe's mind, like a crystal mirror, would crack. Constance Collier, who briefly served as Monroe's acting teacher, was fascinated by her pupil's flickering intelligence. It's so fragile and sub-tle it can only be caught by the camera. Collier and Greta Garbo agreed Monroe would make an exquisite Ophelia, perhaps because, like Henry Cartier-Bresson, they viewed her as an apparition in a fairy tale, with something extremely alert and vivid in her, an intelligence. Something very tenuous. That appears disappears quickly, that appears again. John Huston said, "What really counts in film acting is that rare mo the Lady of Shaw Lot 237 meant. Just a flickering, when through the eyes you get a glimpse of the real meaning of the character. It is not technique or professionalism, just truth." Garbo had it, Monroe had it. Some, like Arthur Miller, believed that with a little luck she might have survived, for she had a worldly side and a tenacity, a faith that you're always as good as your potential. A certainty that never deserted her until that last moment. In tape recordings of the Richard Merriman life interview, the A.C. Tress's voice is strong, full-bodied, and active, ringing with laughter. One person can be heard in the laughter, energizing her listeners as well as herself. The woman with this robust laugh, this woman momentarily at one with her mature self, was never seen on the screen. The laughter sounds like it comes from the core of her being, the core for which she searched. The laughter justifies her claim that on screen and off, she had more to express than her roles permitted. If she went to pieces at the last, she still seems to be calling, entreating her audience to find me, complete this form. This page intentionally left blank. Afterward, the murder of Marilyn Monroe, so much has been written about Marilyn Monroe, and the Kennedy broth ers. Much of it based on stories that cannot be verified and on conflicting accounts, that it is nearly impossible to filter out fact from fiction. The Los Angeles coroner's office ruled her death in the early morning hours of August 5, 1962. A probable suicide, after an autopsy revealed substantial amounts of the barbiturate nembutal and chloral hydrate in her body, and after conducting an investigation that disclosed her previous attempts to end her life. Even so, rumors persisted that she had been the victim of foul play. Conspiracy theorists noted discrepancies in the accounts of Monroe's final hours given by her housekeeper, Eunice Murray, as well as the suspicions of a Los Angeles policeman called to the death scene at Helena Drive. He believed that Monroe's body had been moved. Exactly how long Monroe had been dead before the police arrived, who was in the house on the night of the 4th, and who stood to benefit from her murder, all became part of the catalog of conjecture in books purporting to expose the plot to silence Marilyn Monroe. Similar kinds of conspiracy theories had surfaced after the mystery-oozed death of Jean Harlow's husband, Paul Byrne, and after Harlow's own shocking early demise. But these precedents pale in comparison to the mystique that soon attached itself to the death of Marilyn Monroe. She became the blameless victim, and her death the annihilation of American innocence. She had become involved, it was alleged, in the nefarious underworld of organized crime, the clandestine activities of the CIA, and the seamy side of Camelot, where the Kennedys used women and whatever else came to hand in order to promote their political ambitions and their private pleasures. This transformation of Marilyn Monroe from a movie star to an icon situated at the very epicenter of American political and cultural life began virtually hours after her death. In Monroe's FBI file, a July 9, 1963, memorandum reports that Walter Winchell's New York Mirror column the previous day claimed that Martha Donaldson's photoplay article, a F-ter word 240, 1 year later Marilyn Monroe killer still at large, practically named the murderer. Winchell, a famous gossip columnist and purveyor of sensationalist news, liked to affect an insider's knowledge of mysterious events. In this case, he claimed to know the identity of the married man involved in Monroe's death, and that, like other members of the press, he hinted at the name. In fact, as the FBI memorandum pointed out, the photoplay article comes nowhere near identifying anyone. The only clues to the identity of the alleged married man who had an affair with Marilyn and caused her suicide when he rejected her could apply to any number of prominent individuals. Of course, this is precisely why such articles work. They create an air of innuendo and intrigue that proves irresistible, giving a flimsy story a cultural currency because of the public's interest in the behind-the-scenes lives of the famous. The photoplay article is striking because it establishes so many key elements in the Marilyn Monroe murder myth. Her married lover is world-famous, a family man. He never dreamed of falling in love with Monroe when he was at the height of his powers, and she was in the depths of her career. His dilemma is that he is an honorable man who must disappoint Monroe's hopes that he will divorce his wife and marry her. His final call to her on August 4, breaking off their affair, is what drives her to commit suicide. This last detail, that she commits suicide by taking an overdose of sleeping pills, would be turned into murder in the next phase of conspiracy theories. But the article left even this possibility open by reporting that Eunice Murray had disappeared, not true, and that Monroe's married lover had to cope every day with his guilty role in her death. On October 23, 1964, an FBI field agent filed a report from an unattributed source alleging a romance between Robert Kennedy and Marilyn Monroe. Begun after Kennedy's sister, Patricia Kennedy Lawford, introduced him to Monroe at the home of her husband, actor Peter Lawford. During the latter half of 1961 and early 1962, Kennedy is supposed to have seen Monroe while meeting with producer Jerry Wald and others about a film based on his brother's heroism in World War II. A deeply emotional Kennedy promised Monroe he would divorce his wife and marry her. Eventually, Monroe realized that he had no intention of marrying her, and then he had broken another promise by not bothering to pressure Fox to reinstate her contract. Her repeated calls to him led to unpleased words between them. Monroe threatened to make their affair public. With the collusion of Eunice Murray and Patricia Newcomb, Monroe's her word 241 personal press agent and secretary. A prescription for barbiturates, sleeping pills, was put beside Monroe's bedside table. In her distraught condition, the conspirators were certain that she would take the pills and, following her usual pattern, call out for help and expect her stomach to be pumped. This time, however, no one came to her assistance. The report implied that her psychiatrist, Ralph Greenson, might also have been aware of the plot, since he did not enter her home until after her death, even though she had called him about the overdose. Within 48 hours of Monroe's death, Patricia Newcomb was flown to the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport, Massachusetts, to join Peter Lawford, who was evidently also part of the cover-up. Joe DiMaggio, somehow aware of the plot against Monroe, vowed to kill Kennedy after he left office. The FBI report, labeled as unverifiable, also recounted sex parties that John Kennedy had attended in Hollywood. Los Angeles Police Chief William Parker had records of the Kennedys' involvement with other women, but kept this material in a safe and helped to rig the inquiry into Monroe's death so that the details of her affairs would not be made public and the Kennedys would not be implicated in her death. Tape recordings of the Kennedys having sex were also supposed to be in the possession of a Los Angeles detective agency. FBI files are notoriously unreliable. They are simply collections of all the intelligence agents collect in the field. No efforts are made to corroborate the material. Instead, such reports become part of a watch list, so to speak, a practice that became standard during J. Edgar Hoover's leadership of the FBI. Marilyn Monroe had become a person of interest as soon as she stood by Arthur Miller, supporting not only his HUAC testimony, but generally endorsing his left-wing politics. Just how deeply the mystique surrounding Marilyn Monroe's death had penetrated into the popular imagination by the mid-1960s is apparent in a letter to Hoover from a woman living in a trailer park in Winter Haven, Florida. On January 20, 1965, Mrs. Alta Melton, Americanism chairman of Mothers of World War II, Inc., announced her campaign to suppress untrue rumors. She wanted Hoover's opinion on a pamphlet she had been handed. Suicide or Murder connected the former Attorney General to Monroe. Such reading can do much to undermine one's character, and I would like to know if there is any truth to any of it. It mentions communism also, and that is why I am interested. It is not surprising that Mrs. Melton wrote to Hoover, famous for alerting the country to the dangers of subversives, communists posing as good a her word 242 Americans, and the author of a best-selling book on the subject, Mass Tours of Deceit. Hoover replied on January 26, 1965, expressing his desire to help Mrs. Melton, but indicating that the FBI, as a strictly investigative agency, made no evaluations and drew no conclusions as to the char actor or integrity of any organization, publication, or individual. So he could not answer her question. Instead, he enclosed several of his articles about the communist conspiracy, the role of intelligence agencies, like the FBI, and the sensationalism of newspaper columnists and magazines like Photoplay, produced a paranoid climate in which the death of Marilyn Monroe could easily be exploited. The first books alleging some sort of conspiracy to murder Monroe that involved the Kennedys appeared toward the end of the 1960s, the product of right-wing authors seeking to discredit the Kennedy legacy. But these publications drew almost no attention from the mainstream press, then mainly preoccupied with the many books alleging a conspiracy to assassinate President Kennedy. Reputable biographers shied away from the unseemly and uncorroborated aspects of the Monroe-Kennedy saga, but friends of Monroe began to speak with biographer Fred Lawrence Giles, who published the first full-scale biography of Monroe, Norma Jeane, The Life of Marilyn Monroe, in 1970. Wary of what he could not substantiate, Giles referred to Robert Kennedy as the Easterner, and placed Kennedy in Monroe's Helena drive home on at least one occasion, without indulging in the conspiracy theories of earlier books and articles. For many years, Giles's book remained the most thorough and respected account of Monroe's life. When Norman Mailer published his controversial biography of Monroe in 1973, he relied heavily on Giles and included a chapter speculating on murder conspiracy theories that involved the Kennedys' desire to eliminate Monroe, because she was planning to hold a press conference exposing secrets they had told her about the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba and other sensitive national security matters. Although Mailer did not endorse such stories, he promoted them, so they became the subject of network television coverage and documentaries. Interest in a Monroe-Kennedy liaison broadened in 1974, when Rob Slatzer published The Curious Death of Marilyn Monroe, claiming that his friend Marilyn had confided to him the story of her involvement with the Kennedys and her anger over their decision to drop her from their circle. By way of asserting intimate knowledge about Monroe, her word 243 Slatzer revealed that he had been briefly married to her before she wed Joe DiMaggio. Slatzer could produce no proof, saying the marriage had taken place on October 4, 1952, in Mexico, and been dissolved there a few days later after Monroe had second thoughts. Other than a few photographs showing him with Monroe, Slatzer had no documentation of their relationship, and several friends close to Monroe, who had never heard of Slatzer, doubted his story. Donald Spoto's biography of Monroe includes a devastating demolition of Slatzer's claims, but Slatzer's detailed account, beginning with him meeting the aspiring actress in 1946, provided the first fully worked-out rationale for her involvement with the Kennedys. He portrayed the young Marilyn as a conscientious, self-educated person who cared deeply about public affairs and was flattered by the attention that both John and Robert Kennedy paid to her, until they suddenly withdrew from contact with her, leaving the actress in a vulnerable state in the last summer of her life, when she was trying to restore her confidence after Fox had fired her. Since the appearance of Mailer's and Slatzer's books, a slew of biographies have appeared purporting to reveal the conspiracy to murder Marilyn Monroe. Some accounts suggest involvement by the mafia, with Monroe getting caught up in the mob's revenge against the Kennedys for their investigations of organized crime. Other books contend the CIA was also involved, as well as Jimmy Hoffa, who had his own animus against Robert Kennedy for initiating the prosecution that led to Hoffa's incarceration in federal prison. And so the suspicion of a vast conspiracy against Marilyn Monroe persists. But that, of course, is the problem. The conspiracy would have to be intricate and call upon participants with conflicts of interest to collaborate in keeping a secret. Successful conspiracies are, by definition, successful because they do not come to light, even when the conspirators are named, as they often are in books about Monroe's murder. The so-called evidence never leads to a conviction, except in the writers' minds. But then, there is an explanation for this result too. It is not in the interest of the authorities to act on the evidence of crimes that will embarrass or otherwise compromise the powers that be. The world of conspiracy theories is self-contained and utterly satisfying to those who believe in conspiracies. It is, in sum, a tautological world. Monroe's fame endures in part because of this conspiratorial literature. No biographer of Marilyn Monroe can give a public talk or interview without addressing the question of whether she was murdered. A F. word 244, the penchant for dwelling on the deaths of famous people, has always been part of what perpetuates their fame. We take some share and even some satisfaction in their deaths. Tom Paine argues in his book on fame, death is a part of the way our icons give themselves up to us, and so we want to know the details of their deaths, no matter how gory. It is a form of participation in the icon's glory that is as old as Homer. Paine reminds us, grieving for the dead icon brings us together in a way that makes us civilized, however odd that might seem. Some of Monroe's iconic appeal is due to the desire of those who want to regard her as suffering for the sins of a corrupt society that passes entertainment and politics, Hollywood and Washington, D.C. One of the little ironies of Monroe's biography is that David Conover, the Army corporal photographer who discovered her in an airplane factory, was given his assignment by Ronald Reagan, a movie star then in the Army, and later to become President of the United States. Monroe's continuing appeal owes at least something to these kinds of connections, which make her life a fabulous network of associations with America's post-war history. She first appeared in the mid-1940s, at a time of great promise, with the country emerging victorious from World War II, and with Hollywood films reaching their peak attendance. A good deal of her trouble also coincided with an industry in decline, not merely losing its audience, but also its monopoly over the entertainment industry. And then Hollywood was devastated by charges that some of its actors, directors, and writers had been disloyal. Members of a conspiracy determined to subvert American freedoms and gradually surrender the country to Soviet propaganda, and even, perhaps, to a communist government. Stars like Monroe had to be watched, an FBI file established on them, and kept in line by their studios. That Monroe rebelled against her studio and took progressive stands on the issues of her time makes her all the more central to the post-war period, so that she becomes something larger than just a 1950 sex symbol. Donald Spoto notes that Monroe's ascent to stardom coincided with the controversy over sexual behavior in the human female, 1953. Alfred Kinsey's controversial study, which appeared just as audiences were watching Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, featuring an orgasmic "Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend" musical number that had a consort of tuxedoed men quite literally falling at Monroe's feet. In nearly 12,000 interviews with women, Kinsey dealt directly with female orgasm and suggested that women had an interest in sex, that the pretenses of Puritan, a F. word 245 Victorian moralism, had denied. Civic, school, and church groups, not to mention the Legion of Decency and the Production Code, attacked Kinsey's report, even as Monroe on screen reveled in the sexuality that Hollywood no longer wanted to keep under wraps. Although Fox hedged its bets by replacing the diamond-studded gown Monroe was supposed to wear with a much more sedate, if elegant, dark pink gown with a high neckline. A version of that jewel-encrusted dress would not appear again until Monroe sang "Happy Birthday to JFK" in 1962. In other words, Monroe and her studio skirted the moors of the 1950s by presenting, in Spoto's words, a quietly aggressive, if frankly carnal creature. Vulnerable and frightened though she was, and often appeared on screen, there was yet something tenacious and independent about her. Above all, she seemed a woman with a strong sense of her body's power. She was an exponent, a summary of the post-war American woman Kinsey reported, and like Kinsey's woman, she could not yet be taken seriously. It would take the culture decades to catch up with Kinsey and Monroe, Spoto suggests, because both represented the unfulfilled dreams and the personal, not merely sexual maturity both longed for and feared in the American woman. Sociologue Ist. Paige Beatty observes that Monroe assumes the traces of the decades. She is a poster girl for the 1950, evoking nostalgia for a bygone and seemingly innocent era, representing somehow a safer world that was destroyed by President Kennedy's assassination. But she is also shorthand for the confusion, mourning, nostalgia, and loss, the marks of a common contemporary condition, and one of the unsolved mysteries of the 1960s for those who ask, who killed Marilyn Monroe? For virtually all those who are attracted to her, she embodies a nostalgia that recalls the difficulties of the American self, the quest to invent or reinvent an identity in a land entranced with the idea of the self-made man and woman. As Andy Warhol demonstrated in his multiple silkscreen images of Monroe, she is, in Beatty's words, powerful in part because she can be made up again and again in so many different ways. Like many myths and the icons who embody those myths, she is a collection of opposites that can be read as emblematic of American history. So Beatty contends, we are a nation narrated by characters with double histories and identity ties. What circulates on one page as sunny life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness may flip to reveal a history of corruption, mishandling, theft, and loss. Monroe is an example of hope and hazard, Beatty concludes, her word 246. Marilyn is a bountiful icon because she expresses both sides of the American political cultural coin, the rich possibilities and the costs of dreaming an American life. Thank you for listening to Blur. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more immersive audiobooks.